everyone. Welcome to Fundamentals of Cybersecurity, CSCI150N. This is Chapter 7, PKI Standards and Protocols, and I'm your instructor, Peter Keurig. In this chapter, we're going to explore the public key infrastructures, some of the standards that are used in it, as well as protocols that help to support it. This is an outline of the different protocols and standards we're going to look at. And before we get too wrapped up around the axle on it, I just want to explain that for the purpose of this course, I'm not expecting you to memorize all the fine details of all these different protocols. Just understand what some of them do. If you are planning to take the Security Plus exam or something like the CISSP or CISM, then you're going to really want to get into the more finer details of these protocols. But as you'll see in the coming slides, we're going to just stick to some real basics on these protocols and standards. The first section of this chapter covers PKIX and PKCS. PKIX, the way that I try to remember this one is the X kind of stands for exchange. PKIX defines the standards for interaction and operations for four component types. That's the user or end entity, the certificate authority, the registration authority, and the repository for certificates and certificate revocation lists. Then PKCS defines many of the lower level standards for the message syntax, the cryptography, the algorithms, and the like. So, like I said, don't get wrapped up around the axle on the fine details of it. Just remember that the PKIX is involved in the exchange of those four types. And as I stated before, once again, I don't expect you to memorize all the specifications of these standards unless you're planning to take one of the exams. However, if you do also plan to work for a company or in the industry where you do need to implement a public key infrastructure, then you're going to have to go back and revisit this. But until that time comes, memorizing the finer details is not expected. Whenever you work with cryptography and the public key infrastructure, you're going to hear a lot about the X509 standards or certificates, part of the X500 standards. So what you really need to know is that it's a portion of the X500 standards that addresses the structure and the certificates used for authentication. So you'll see it in things like radius and other authentication mechanisms. Version 3 is the current version, and each version has extended the contents of the certificates to include additional information necessary to use the certificates in the PKI environment that they're supporting. So they add on things such as phone number, address, things of that sort. Once again, don't get wrapped around the axle on it. It does define a hierarchical certificate structure that relies on a root CA, and so this is the X509 certificate standard is essential to public key infrastructure, and it goes back to the previous chapter where we were talking about the root certificate authority all the way down to the certificate issued to the individual user, and how it traces back to the intermediate certificate authorities and so forth. So SSL and TLS. Most of you who have been around for a little bit on the internet should at least know what SSL is, and TLS is its replacement. It was originally developed by Netscape as a means of providing secure connections for web transfers and transactions. It's really what drove e-commerce on the internet. But versions 2 and 3, which are the last two versions of SSL, had some major vulnerabilities in it, including the Heartbleed vulnerability. And so really SSL has been retired and TLS has taken its place at this point. 1.0 is the standard. There is a 1.1 and a 1.2, but you're going to find that most sites that are using TLS right now are at 1.0. There are still some sites out there still using SSL, but they should be starting to go away, and I'd be suspect of any site that continues to use it after the next couple of years. These two protocols, as I said, provide secure connections between the client and the server for exchanging information. They also provide authentication and confidentiality of the transfers. SSL and TLS are cryptographic protocols to provide data integrity and security over networks by encrypting network connections at the transport layer. So that's just above the protocol layer, the IP layer, the network layer. In many cases, people use the term SSL even when they're talking about TLS. In fact, is the protocol being used. Since SSL is going away and TLS is becoming pretty much the standard now, let's kind of look at how a transaction happens with a client and a server with TLS. Essentially, the client reaches out to the server and says, "Hello, I'm here. I want to talk to you." The client says, "These are the different types of protocols or algorithms that I have available to me to talk to you with." And the server responds back, "Okay, well, these are the certificates that I'm willing to work with, and the algorithms I'm willing to work with." And the two of them pretty much negotiate. And once they determine what they're going to use for a session, they use a public key transfer, so a private key and a public key, to transfer the secret key to do a symmetric encryption transfer afterwards. So, kind of how we talked in a previous chapter about how the asymmetric and symmetric algorithms are joined together to do transactions on the internet. This is exactly what's happening with TLS. Is they negotiate what algorithm they're going to use. So it could be like triple DES, it could be AES, it could be a lot of different things. But they agree upon it, and then they generate a random key. The client transfers that random key to the server, and the server uses that to establish the connection. And that is good for the duration of the connection between the two systems. As you can see, we're kind of progressing away from using unilateral, symmetric or asymmetric algorithms in order to do things, and we're moving more into a hybrid direction, especially with the TLS as an example. So what we're really getting into now are cipher suites, which are basically just packages of algorithms and functions that work together to provide capabilities. So it's no longer just one cryptographic function that's available. You can have it for you can have the PKI infrastructure in place to do signatures and validation, authentication, and things of that sort. And yet you can have the symmetric algorithms in that same suite in order to do large-scale data transfer. And then you have the asymmetric and the symmetric algorithms working together in order to establish the two-way connection between the server and the client in order to do it. So that's what they mean by when they're talking about cipher suites. It's a wide range of ciphers that are grouped together in order to do certain functions. It is important to note that not all ciphers are still in use. Some of them have been considered broken, or they're currently weak and expect to be broken. So when you do use a cipher suite, you do need to verify that your chosen ciphers are valid still and provide the protection you are seeking for the task or the function you're using it with. So this acronym you often hear referred to as ISACAMP. It means Internet Security Association and Key Management Protocol. It provides a method or an implementation key exchange protocol and for negotiating a security policy. It defines procedures and packet formats to negotiate, establish, modify, and delete secure associations. It's important to note the term security association. It's a relationship in which two or more entities define how they will communicate securely. So going back to, let's say, the TLS, the server and the web browser on the client side, that is a security association once they have started and initiated the communication together with each other. ISACAMP is intended to support a security association at all levels of the network stack. It can be implemented on a transport layer using TCP or UDP, or it can be implemented in the IP layer directly. Negotiations of a security association between servers occur in two stages. First, the entities agree how to secure negotiation communications, and then once the entities have secured their negotiation traffic, then they can determine the security association for protocols to use for the remainder of their communications. CMP, or Certificate Management Protocol, defines the messages and operations required to provide certificate management services within the PKX model. and it is used to obtain X509 certificates in a public key infrastructure. XKMS, the XML Key Management Specification, defines the services to manage PKI operations within the extensible markup language environment. These services are provided for handling PKI keys and certificates automatically. They were developed to address problems of authentication and verification of electronic XKMS also allows certificates to be managed, registered, or revoked. XKMS service resides on a separate server that interacts with the established PKI, and the services are accessible via a simple XML protocol. So, SMIME, the Secure Multipurpose Internet Mail Extensions. You'll see this actually more than you think. If your environment is using Outlook and Exchange and it offers the Outlook web access as a means of accessing their email using Internet Explorer, you'll use SMIME to encrypt and use signatures for those emails. It is a message specification extension to MIME standard that provides a way to send and receive signed and encrypted MIME data. It uses the AES encryption algorithm and the PKCS series of standards. Now, in addition to Outlook Web Access, if you have a Gmail account, you can actually use SMIME in Gmail. So if you have a key, and there's instructions, I believe, on Gmail for this. But if you get yourself a public key and a private key, you can actually send encrypted emails using Gmail. And after what happened this last election cycle with Podesta's emails coming from Gmail being leaked, if you want to deal with anything sensitive in Gmail, using Gmail, I would highly recommend encrypting it using SMIME. SMIME provides two security services to email. It's the digital signature to authenticate the person who sent it, so that it provides non-repudiation, and message encryption, which is for your confidentiality. Digital signatures verify sender identity, and encryption can keep contents private during a transmission. These services can be used independently of each other and provide the functional basis for message security. So SMIME is an important one to know. That's if there's any here besides TLS that you really need to keep in the back of your mind. This is one of the ones. So PGP, or Pretty Good Privacy, has been around since the 90s. It used to be open source shareware, and today it is commercial. However, in keeping with the original intent, the project has an offshoot that has remained in the public domain, which is the GNU Privacy Guard GPG, which is an alternative to PGP, and I've not had any problems with it. It's worked fine for me. It's pretty straightforward. It uses asymmetric encryption. You generate a public and a private key. It also provides the ability to digitally sign messages as well as to encrypt them. Taken together, encrypting and signing a message allows the receiver to be assured that who sent the message and to know that it has not been modified during transmission. PGP has worked as a plugin for many email programs since the 90s. Outlook being a big one. I'm trying to think. What was the one that Netscape had? Whatever theirs was, I remember that was one of the ones it worked with. And then I think it's Thunderbird is now the Mozilla project for an email program, and PGP will work with that as well, and GPG will work with that as well. So HTTPS really has become the backbone of what we call the World Wide Web today. HTTP was the start for it, but almost everything today requires some kind of encryption, and that's partially to authenticate that the server you're connecting with is who you intend to be with, versus let's say a rogue system out there. So, for example, Google. You do really need your searches to be secure and encrypted. Um, Probably not. However, by them using the HTTPS protocol, you get in your web browser, you can look and you can actually see the certificate and know that you're getting your search results directly back from Google, as opposed to somebody hijacking a session and redirecting you to another server and giving you false results that may be used to guide you towards maybe some malicious software or something of that sort. So HTTPS, even when it's not necessarily dealing with confidential things, is still being used today just to validate that the organization you're connecting with is who you think it is, because of the signed certificate associated with the HTTPS session. Those of you who are studying Cisco should know that HTTPS uses port 443, well, HTTP uses port 80, and it's predominantly HTTPS used to be SSL, was the driving the encryption or the protection behind HTTPS, but now you're finding more and more sites have transitioned over to TLS, thanks to some of the big bugs that came out in 2.0 and 3.0. IPsec is another important one to know, and I would say by my personal opinion, it's underutilized with the IPv4 stack, but you're going to see more of it now that it's directly implemented in IPv6. So with IPv4, IPsec was an optional an option that was available to you when configuring your network. So you could, for example, use it to create tunnels between two routers. So your traffic, let's say you were going between two different campuses, one in Boston and one in Los Angeles, and you're crossing over the internet in the open. You could use it to make a tunnel between the two sites, kind of like a VPN, that would encrypt either the payload or the entire packet, including your the destination IP address and things of that sort, in order to protect not only the payload, but to prevent from giving out valuable information about your internal network to whoever might be listening out on the wire in between the two locations. It is a collection of IP security features designed and introduced to secure at the network or packet processing layer in the network communications. IPsec is designed to provide secure IP communications over the internet. In essence, IPsec provides a secure version of IP by introducing authentication and encryption to protect layer 4 communications. IPsec is optional for IPv4, as I mentioned, but is required for IPv6. Both ends of the communications need to use IPsec for the encryption and a decryption process to occur, and they must use the same settings as well. So it requires synchronization when configuring, which goes a little more in depth than what we're going to go to in this section here. IPsec provides two types of security service to ensure authentication and confidentiality. The encryption of the payload or the data alone is often referred to as transport mode. So think of it as, and think of like I just said, the word payload. You would have that, let's say a dump truck. It's basically securing what's in the back of the dump truck, or for both the data and the header, which is called tunneling, which basically the entire encryption, the entire communication is encrypted, so as not to provide any information of what's in the payload or where that payload is going, other than the other end of the tunnel. So it just basically shuts off the capability for anyone to read any information of what's in that packet. IPsec introduces several new protocols, including the authentication header, which basically provides authentication of the sender, and the encapsulating security payload, which adds encryption of the data to ensure. With certificate enrollment protocol, really the only thing to remember is that it was designed to support certificate issuance, distribution, and revocation using existing technology. So it's really not developing anything new. It's just taking what's out there and putting it into a protocol that supports these specific tasks. So if you ever work around the government in an IT setting, you're going to hear the acronym FIPS, Federal Information Processing Standards. The National Institute of Standards and Technology has developed these Federal Information Processing Standards into publications to help guide the federal government in doing certain things with information and information technology. Now, a lot of businesses have adopted it either because they're doing business with the government or they see these as being pretty stringent standards that only serve to help their organization do better. In this particular case, remember that the FIPS standards cover hardware and software standards, data standards, and security standards. And we're going to see FIPS again later. So there are some other standards that the book covers, not into great detail, but just enough that it makes worth noting. First is the Common Criteria for Information Technology Security. It is basically an international standard that's been developed between the European Union and the United States, more specifically Great Britain, Canada, France, and Germany in the United States, as a means of setting standards for hardware security, so that it's equal standards or consistent standards across each of these nations, and each one's not writing its own standard. It helps with companies such as Cisco with developing things such as ASAs and firewalls, so that it's consistent in each of the countries they're selling the product in. And then WTLS, we just talked about the Transport Layer Security Protocol. Well, this is basically the wireless version of it for your phones. It is based on the TLS protocol. It provides reliability and security for wireless communications using wireless application protocol. WTLS is necessary due to the limited memory and processing abilities of a WAP-enabled phone. Next is ISO 27002, formerly known as 17799. It is a set of security standards that many industries have chosen to apply. Now, I think we talked earlier about the NIST cybersecurity framework and how organizations can choose to adopt it. And one of the great things about a framework is a framework just helps to lay out the overall program, but it does not dictate the standards. And so what you would do is take a standard like this here, the ISO 27002, and you'll pop it into the NIST framework. So you keep the NIST framework, which is provided by the federal government, and then you pop the standards in, and then when you're putting the standards in, if you ever take a look at ISO 27002, you can see that you can add and remove components from that based upon what you have in your environment. Now, ISO 27002 does have 12 sections to it, or subdivisions to it. One of them is risk assessment and determining the impact of risk. Then next is security policy and the guidance and policy provided by management. Then the organization of information security, asset management, human resource security, physical and environmental security, communications and operations management, access control, information system acquisitions, information security incident management, business continuity management, and then compliance insurance. And finally, the chapter rounds out with the SAML, or Security Assurance Markup Language protocol. It's a single sign-on capability used for web applications to ensure user identities can be shared and are protected. It identifies standards for exchanging authentication and authorization data between security domains. It is becoming increasingly important with cloud-based solutions and with software as a service applications because it ensures interoperability across identity providers. SAML is based on XML protocol that uses security tokens and assertions to pass information about a principal or an end user with an SML authority and the service provider. The principal requests a service from the service provider and then requests and obtains an identity assurance from the identity provider. The service provider can then grant access or perform the requested service for the principal or the user. I'm your instructor, Peter Keurig for Nashville Community College. Thank you for watching.